The camera was still recording when the figure stepped forward and reached up to cover the lens. There was nothing frantic about the movement, no hesitation or second-guessing. It was controlled, almost practiced, one gloved hand rising with quiet certainty, as if the person already understood exactly where the camera was positioned and what it could capture. In the seconds that followed, the visual record fractured into something incomplete, something obstructed. And somewhere in that narrow gap between what was seen and what was hidden, an 84-year-old woman disappeared. This was not the kind of disappearance that resolves itself with a phone call or a simple explanation. It was not the kind where someone leaves and later returns, embarrassed or disoriented. This was something colder, more final in its first impression. The kind of vanishing that leaves behind physical evidence where there should be none, blood on a front porch at 1:47 in the morning. The kind that transforms a lived-in home into a place of absence, where silence feels unnatural, almost imposed. The kind that draws investigators back repeatedly, not because they miss something obvious, but because the truth feels buried beneath layers they have yet to fully uncover. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. Her life had settled into a rhythm shaped by age, routine, and necessity. She depended on daily medication, something that made any unexplained absence immediately alarming. She was not someone prone to wandering, not someone who would vanish without a trace or a reason. By all accounts, she lived quietly, surrounded by the familiarity of her home and the distant presence of a family that cared for her deeply. She was a mother, a grandmother, a private individual whose life had never been meant to intersect with something like this. That changed in a single morning. When authorities arrived at her home, they were not walking into uncertainty, they were walking into evidence. The porch told part of the story before anyone spoke a word. There was blood. Not a small amount, not something easily dismissed or explained away. Testing would later confirm what those first impressions already suggested. It was hers. That detail alone shifted the nature of the case. This was no longer a question of whether something had happened. It was a question of what and how and why. The Nest security footage added another layer, one that was both revealing and deeply frustrating. It showed a figure approaching the house under the cover of early morning darkness. The person was dressed with intention, a ski mask concealing their face, gloves covering their hands, clothing that revealed nothing distinctive. A backpack rested against their back. An analyst who reviewed the footage noted what appeared to be a holstered firearm. Every visible detail suggested preparation. This was not random. This was not impulsive. What stood out most, however, was the interaction with the camera itself. When the figure appeared to notice the lens, they did not retreat. They did not attempt to avoid its field of view. Instead, they engaged with it, reaching up in a measured, deliberate motion to obscure it. That action alone has been dissected repeatedly because it speaks to awareness. It suggests that the individual not only anticipated surveillance but had planned for it. It was not panic. It was procedure. And yet, even in that controlled moment, there may have been a flaw. Analysts examining the footage pointed to what looked like a small tear in one of the gloves, near the fingertip. It is the kind of detail that could mean nothing or everything. In a case defined by careful concealment, even the smallest imperfection becomes significant. A tear could allow for DNA transfer, for trace evidence that survives despite every attempt to eliminate it. Whether that detail proves meaningful remains unknown, but it lingers as one of the few possible points where control may have slipped. What makes the situation more unsettling is the absence of additional footage. The property reportedly had more cameras, angles that might have captured different perspectives, movements, perhaps even the moments before or after what the Nest device recorded. But those cameras were inactive. No subscription. No recording. No backup. In a case where visual evidence could have provided clarity, that gap is not just unfortunate. It is defining. Entire segments of the timeline are missing, not because they were erased, but because they were never captured at all. As the investigation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that this case did not follow familiar patterns. Traditional kidnapping scenarios tend to carry certain markers: communication, demands, a degree of predictability rooted in human relationships or financial motives. This case resisted those expectations. The presence of ransom notes initially suggested one direction, but even those communications lacked consistency. They arrived in fragments, without the structure investigators typically rely on. Then came the revelation that at least one of those ransom notes was fraudulent, sent by an individual with no legitimate connection to the crime. That discovery complicated everything. It introduced noise into an already uncertain signal. Now every message had to be questioned, every demand scrutinized not only for its content but for its origin. It blurred the line between genuine leads and opportunistic interference, slowing progress in a case where time was already working against the victim. Meanwhile, the actions of investigators began to tell a story of their own, one that diverged, quietly but unmistakably, from the hopeful tone of public statements. Authorities returned to the property multiple times, each visit more focused than the last. They were not simply searching rooms or canvassing the surrounding area. They were probing deeper. Literally. The septic tank was opened and examined. The ground itself was tested and disturbed. Tools were brought in not for surface-level inspection, but for exploring what lay beneath. These are not standard procedures in a search for a living person. They are methodical, deliberate actions taken when investigators believe that answers may be hidden below the visible world, concealed, buried, or otherwise out of reach. There were also indications that attention had turned toward the structure of the property itself. Not just what could be seen, but what might exist underneath. Spaces not immediately apparent, areas that could have been overlooked or intentionally concealed. While nothing has been officially confirmed, the nature of these searches suggests that investigators are considering possibilities far beyond the initial assumptions. And through all of this, the human element remains impossible to ignore. Nancy Guthrie is not just the subject of an investigation. She is a person whose absence has created a void that cannot be filled by speculation or procedure. Her family exists in a state of suspended reality, caught between what they hope is still possible and what the evidence increasingly suggests. Her daughter has stood in front of cameras, not as a journalist delivering news, but as someone living through it, speaking directly to whoever might hold the answers, using visibility as a tool in a situation where so little else can be controlled. Time continues to pass, and with it comes a shift in atmosphere. The urgency of the early days has given way to something heavier, more measured. Official statements remain careful, emphasizing possibility, avoiding finality. But the investigation itself, its direction, its focus, its methods, reflects a growing recognition that this is no longer a straightforward search. There are still pieces missing. Critical ones. The identity of the figure on camera. The events that occurred after the lens was covered. The explanation for the blood on the porch. The meaning behind the fragmented ransom notes. Each unanswered question adds weight to the others, creating a narrative that feels incomplete, but not directionless. At its center is that moment, 1:47 in the morning. A point in time that now carries enormous significance. Everything before it was normal. Everything after it is uncertain. The figure, the motion, the obstruction of the camera, it all exists within that narrow window, a brief sequence that has come to define an entire investigation. Somewhere beyond that moment, the truth exists in full. Not as fragments or theories, but as a complete sequence of events. Investigators are moving toward it, piece by piece, guided by evidence that is not yet visible to the public. Whether that truth will confirm the darkest suspicions or reveal something entirely unexpected remains unknown. For now, what remains is the absence, the evidence, and the quiet persistence of a search that has not yet reached its conclusion.